So just while people are logging on, I'm just going to provide a short introduction to Graeme. So I'm not going to talk for too long at all. And then I'll help to moderate the questions at the end, and then Graeme will provide his talk on Napoleon and the French Revolution. What is important is if you have any questions, please do use the Q&A button at any point. We'll collect them together at the end, and Graeme and I will work through them. Obviously, Graeme will provide the historical answers, and I'll just help him as and where he needs it, which he probably won't. But please do ask any questions all the way through, and I'm confident Graeme will be more than happy to answer as many as we can in the time that is allotted to us. So what I think we should do then, seeing as we've got quite a few people already logged on, is actually begin. So it's my great privilege and honour this evening to provide an introduction, not simply to a wonderful historian and a very gifted lecturer, but actually also to a very good friend of mine, Dr. Graeme Callister. Graeme is someone I've known for several years now. I've had the great pleasure to teach alongside him. And at some point we have a plan to write a book together. We're still not entirely sure what that would be. I'm an ancient historian. Graeme, of course, is a modern historian, as the title of today's talk would indicate. But we've got plans about working together in the future. Graeme is particularly well known for his work looking at the Napoleonic period, and his modules certainly at St. John's have always been very popular, and students speak very highly of his teaching and his methods. Before joining St. John's, Graeme studied at the University of York. He's also taught at the Universities of Durham and York before joining St. John University. His research interests lie in Britain and Europe in the 18th and the 19th centuries, focusing on public opinion, national identity, but also the making and the ideas governing foreign policy. Graeme also has an abiding interest in civil-military relations since the early modern period. His first book, entitled War, Public Opinion and Policy in Britain, France and the Netherlands, 1785 to 1815, was published in 2017 by Palgrave Macmillan. And the book offered a detailed investigation of the influence of public opinion and national identity on the foreign policies of France, Britain and the Netherlands in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and the quarter century of upheaval and warfare in Europe between the outbreak of the French Revolution and the fall of Napoleon, which saw important developments in the understandings of nation, public and popular sovereignty, which then spilled over into how people viewed their governments and how governments also, perhaps unsurprisingly, viewed their people. By investigating then the ideas and the impulses behind the Dutch, French and British foreign policy in a rather comparative context across a range of royal, revolutionary and republican regimes, what Graeme's book sought to do was to offer new insights into the importance of public opinion and national identities to international relations at the end of the long 18th century. As Graeme wrote in the first chapter of his work, his aim was to examine the interplay of public opinion, national sentiment, foreign policy from this period. And he focused on this interconnection between Netherlands, France, and Great Britain. And in many ways, that not simply informs Graeme's teaching, but it also informs his research as well. As one reviewer commented, this is really a very valuable piece of scholarship and one that provides a very good survey of foreign policy. And while it is wide-ranging, that actually is one of its greatest strengths. Graeme also told me earlier that he's got a few more articles coming out as well. So recent work has included an article on conscription in Napoleonic France, and that this is coming soon to the British Journal for Military History. He's also written an article on Britain's failed defence of the Netherlands in the 1790s, and that will also appear in Diplomacy and Statescraft in December 2021. Graeme's also co-authoring a book entitled Battle, Understanding Conflict from Hastings to Helmond, and that will appear in 2022 with Pen and Sword Books. So what that hopefully gives you is an idea of not simply Graeme's many qualifications and successes and achievements, but also the nature of his scholarship and the nature of the material that he uses. It's important, I think, just to remind us all that we have the opportunity for live captions during Graeme's talk, so you can turn that on. If you would like to, you can turn it on or off, and you can see the live transcript button just there. What Graeme will be talking about tonight, and I'm really grateful to Graeme for sending his piece through to me already, so I've actually had a quick look, a sneak peek. And what it reminded me of, if I'm honest, everyone, is how little I understand the period that Graeme writes about. I thought I knew two things about it. I thought I knew Napoleon, and I thought I knew the French Revolution. Having read what Graeme's about to discuss, I realised I did not know either of them very well. So what I'd like to do then is to pass over to Graeme for his talk, Did Napoleon Betray the French Revolution?
Thanks very much, Ant, and thanks for the very kind introduction there. Very grateful for that. I may be, as Ant says, reasonably proficient with teaching, but I'm not necessarily proficient with technology. So please just give me a second to share my screen, and I apologize if this goes horribly wrong at all. But I am here to address today this question of whether Napoleon betrayed the French Revolution. And it's quite an important day, perhaps, to be asking questions about Napoleon, because exactly 200 years ago today, on the 5th of May 1821, at about 5:25 in the afternoon, Napoleon Bonaparte died in exile on the island of St. Helena. It was an uneventful, and some might even say inglorious, end for a man who had, for better or worse, cast a vast shadow over Europe and over his adopted French homeland. Nigh on 20 years, Napoleon had shaped and reshaped the destiny of the continent, first as a general in the French Revolutionary armies, then as first consul of the Republic, and finally as Emperor of the French. Such was his influence and military strength that it eventually took a coalition of all the major powers of Europe to bring him to heel. Such was their fear of him that once they defeated him, they chose to exile him first to Elba, just off the coast of Italy, and then after a brief reappearance that ended on the bloody field of Waterloo, to St. Helena, over 4,000 miles from home. Yet while Napoleon, the man, slipped softly from this mortal plane on that sultry afternoon in the South Atlantic, his legend lived on. This was no accident. In the years of exile, Napoleon assiduously cultivated this legend, a myth of a man who had fought not for himself, but for France, had won victories not to conquer, but to bring freedom and justice, who had fundamentally waged war as a struggle for peace. This legend of Napoleon portrays him not just as a man of vain ambition, but as the embodiment of something grander. The crowned head of Europe he may have been, but, so the myth maintains, the crown that anointed his imperial brow had been placed there by the French people. When Napoleon came to power in 1799, it was at the end of a decade of revolutionary turmoil and strife, which had seen Frenchmen struggle to build a better country from the ruins of the old royal regime. Napoleon portrayed his consulate and later empire as both the culmination and the perfection of the revolutionary movement, and posited himself as the saviour of the nation, appointed by popular will to secure the revolution's gains while ridding it of its self-destructive excesses. Napoleon was, in his own mind, the heir of the revolution. This has not been, however, how his opponents have seen it. Although Napoleon's coup of 1799 met with indifference by many in France, there were those who despised him from the start as a dictator. Radical Jacobins railed against the man who, they claimed, was setting himself up as a new king. Conservatives, such as Chateaubriand, or liberals like Benjamin Constant, attacked Napoleon's legitimacy, his illiberalism, and his militarism. The accusation has raged since that Napoleon was not the perfecter of the revolution, but its despoiler, not the saviour of the French people, but their subjugator. Over the 2 centuries since Napoleon's death, impressions of the former emperor have been heavily coloured by political allegiance. To Bonapartists and to many moderate monarchists, to centrists, and even to some on the moderate left, Napoleon represented the coming together of revolutionary values and strong leadership. To most Republicans, Napoleon, whatever his other achievements, represented the death of a dream, the sacrifice of all that was good and true about the revolution on the altar of one man's ambitions. It is Napoleon's relationship with the revolution that I want to address today. How fundamentally should we interpret this relationship? That Napoleon ended the French Revolution is generally not contested. Napoleon himself grandly proclaimed that the revolution was finished, although tantalizingly, the word he used in this context could mean achieved as well as ended. But did he end the revolution by achieving its aims or by abandoning them? Did he bring the revolutionary project to fruition, or did he simply plunder it of ideas, institutions, and people that will give him a more efficient dictatorship? In the final analysis, then, did Napoleon betray the French Revolution? Well, to answer that, we must perhaps begin with the question of which revolution. For if we take a broad view, the French Revolution can be, has been, and is all things to all people. The very nature of the revolution has been hotly debated almost since the first shots were fired at the storming of the Bastille in 1789. Even in the 20th century, angry debates raged and much ink was spilt in fierce academic struggles between the Marxist social interpretation of the revolution and the revisionist political interpretation. Revolutionaries at the time also struggled to pin down what the whole thing was actually about. Slogans of liberty, equality, and fraternity were widely accepted, repeatedly parroted, but largely meaningless, as interpretations of those three words varied wildly from person to person and year to year. Moreover, the basic principles of government shifted dramatically between the early seizure of popular sovereignty in 1789 and Napoleon's coup of Brumaire in 1799. The revolution broke out in 1789 when members of the Estates General, invited by King Louis XVI to meet at Versailles to discuss the country's problems, demanded a constitution to limit royal power. Between 1789 and 1792, the revolutionaries embraced the idea of constitutional monarchy, but they struggled to agree on such fundamentals as the role of the king and the extent of popular voting. From 1792, opinion turned against Louis XVI, and the consensus came in favour of a republic. But what republic? There were again vast divisions between moderates and radicals, Girondins and Jacobins, federalists and unitarists. A radical constitution was adopted in 1793, but immediately shelved, and then abandoned entirely in 1795, in favour of a constitution that essentially kept power in the hands of a relatively narrow band of property-owning men. The revolutionaries' commitment to liberty and equality also waxed and waned. In 1789, for example, freedom of expression was prized above almost all things. By 1793, as the machinery of the terror began to creak into action, expressing oneself freely became fraught with danger. By 1794, speaking against the governing cabal became a capital offence. Even under the Directory, which espoused a degree of popular freedom, effective censorship was practiced. Election results were annulled as a matter of course if they went against the desires of the executive. And the revolutionaries really sought to limit the freedoms and the equality of the French people. They did seek to create equality and freedom of worship by ending the privilege of the Catholic Church, but instead they ended up unleashing attacks on religious belief and curtailing freedom of conscience. The revolutionaries stated a commitment to equality in the Declaration of the Rights of Man of 1789 and in the abolition, perhaps, of nobility a year later. But the Constitution of 1791 that they created introduced a distinction between active and passive citizens, essentially giving more rights to the wealthy. The Radical Constitution of 1793 was largely egalitarian, but it was never enacted. The Directory paid lip service to notions of equality while turning France into an effective, or rather ineffective, I suppose, plutocracy. Although the revolution did bring a shuffling movement towards granting women more rights, no regime showed any real commitment to reducing gender inequalities. Similarly, despite the abolition of slavery, the revolutionaries cannot be said to have had any firm desire to tackle racial inequality. In its achievements, there are also question marks over the revolution. France was reorganized entirely, with the old provinces swept away and replaced by departments, taxation completely overhauled, and significant portions of land redistributed. The revolution also swept away the old networks of nepotism and patronage that had made the achievement of high rank attainable only by a select few. Yet it was perhaps better at tearing down the old structures than at building effective replacements. By 1799, almost a third of provincial France was suffering badly from widespread lawlessness and poor administration. If the revolution's record within France was a little confused, so were its external policies. A high-minded declaration of the National Assembly in 1790 that France renounced wars of conquest and sought only peace with all mankind was dead in the water within 2 years, as France declared war on Austria and invaded what is now Belgium. The French army's conquest of Belgium, the Netherlands, the Rhineland, northern Italy in the first 5 years of the war were accompanied by grandiose claims of friendship and fraternity, with the forces claiming to be liberators, not conquerors. Yet these liberated lands were either plundered or stripped of wealth or forced to pay huge indemnities and subsidies to the French army. And their governments were shaped and reshaped on the whim of Parisian power brokers. If liberty came with the French armies, it was enforced at the point of the bayonet, and it's a matter of conjecture whether you can ever really force people to be free. This then is the revolution that Napoleon is accused of betraying, a mass of contradictory and confused ideologies, principles and practices that tended to fall victim to expediency when new dangers and crises emerged. Yet within this, there was a general trajectory towards constitutional government of and for the people, if not quite by the people, and there was a tendency towards greater efficiency of administration, towards social equality that eschewed privilege by birth, and a general commitment to opening posts in government, administration, and the army to those who merited them, rather than those whose birth entitled them to position. In the latter regard, Napoleon was certainly a product of the revolutionary events of the later 18th century. Napoleon's relationship with the revolution was somewhat shaped by his early years. Son of a very minor Corsican nobleman, as an officer, to a king to whom he was fairly ambivalent, and as a romantic sympathizer with the plight of downtrodden peoples. Napoleon indeed identified himself to some extent with the downtrodden, despite his supposedly noble birth. In 1768, the year before Napoleon was born, France acquired the Mediterranean island of Corsica. Napoleon's father was one of those who fought unsuccessfully to resist the French invasion, and although he quickly rallied to the French cause after their conquest, Napoleon's early years were dominated by continued tensions between Corsican nationalists on the one side and their French occupiers on the other. Napoleon's parents ultimately decided that the family's future lay in supporting rather than opposing French rule. So at the age of 8, Napoleon and his elder brother Joseph were shipped off to school in France, where, their father hoped at least, opportunities would open up for them. At the time, French society was highly stratified, with the nobility enjoying immense privilege. To become an officer in the army, for example, one had to have at least 4 generations of noble ancestry. Napoleon's father was able to persuade the French government that his family was in fact descended from an ancient Corsican noble line, and this meant that Napoleon was allowed to enter the Noble Military Academy at Brienne. Most of Napoleon's youth from this point was spent away from his home and his family, growing up in a strange country whose language he spoke only imperfectly, far from his Corsican homeland. He was mocked at school for his accent, for his complexion, for his mannerisms, and he was by no means a great pupil. However, he did well enough to progress from Brienne to the prestigious military academy in Paris, and he passed his exams in 42nd place out of 58 candidates. Due to his aptitude for mathematics and his lack of connections in the more prestigious branches of the army, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant of artillery. Although he was therefore an officer and nobleman of the royal regime, Napoleon the Corsican always felt an outsider. It is little surprise, therefore, that when the revolution broke out in France in 1789, Napoleon found himself sympathizing with the revolutionaries. This time, Napoleon was with his regiment in Exile, but like everyone else in France, he followed the news and events from Versailles and Paris avidly. He rejoiced in the achievements of the National Assembly and the seizure of sovereignty from the king, although he seemed a bit less enthusiastic at the popular violence that accompanied the political changes. Napoleon's writings from the time show his enthusiasm for the revolutionary cause, and if he was not a radical at this stage, he was clearly taken with the ideas of liberty and equality that were at the heart of revolutionary rhetoric. The revolution that broke out in 1789 was the making of Napoleon. Without it, he would likely have spent a long career as an unremarkable and unremarked junior officer in an undistinguished regiment of artillery, lacking either the social or the financial capital to climb up the ranks. Instead, the opening of careers to talent and the war that broke out in 1792 led to enormous opportunities for a man of Napoleon's temperament. Napoleon's chance for advancement came at the siege of the southern French city of Toulon in 1793, which had declared against the revolution and welcomed in a British garrison. Given command of the besieging artillery, Napoleon quickly devised a plan to bring the city back under revolutionary control. The success of this scheme and the favour bestowed on him by the grateful representatives of the government who were present with the army saw Napoleon promoted to brigadier general, a huge leap for a man still only 24 years of age. More fame was to follow. Finding himself in Paris in October of 1795, Napoleon was tasked with commanding the troops defending the National Convention from the attentions of a mob unhappy at the provisions of the new constitution. Using cannon and infantry to hold key positions, Napoleon carried the day, and his infamous whiff of grape shot dispersed the crowd. A grateful government this time promoted him to general of division, and in early 1796 they sent him off to take command of France's army on the Italian front. His unexpected but stunning victories on this front against the armies of Piedmont and Austria catapulted the young man to national and indeed continental fame. And in early 1797, he even took the step of unilaterally agreeing preliminary terms of peace with Austria on behalf of the French government. The revolutionary government by this stage was actually highly indebted to its generals for propping up the moderate republic, but it was also increasingly wary of their popular appeal. They therefore jumped at the chance when Napoleon suggested that he should sail off to Egypt. In 1798, he embarked on a rather ill-fated campaign in which he won a series of tactical victories without really making any strategic headway. However, news that France was once again under threat from an enemy coalition sent Napoleon scurrying back home, and he thus once more found himself at a loose end in Paris in 1799. There, he quickly became embroiled in political intrigues and became convinced that the Republic, and indeed the Revolution, needed saving. In a decade, Napoleon had therefore gone from an impoverished and lowly artillery officer to one of the most famous and successful generals in Europe. The revolution had not only made him, but had made him hot property for political intriguers. The men with whom Napoleon fell in included some high officials, led by two of France's 5 directors, Emmanuel Sieyès and Roger Ducos, who had become convinced that the current regime needed replacing. Deciding that constitutional means could be too difficult, they opted to use the army to push for political change. Not exactly a novel idea, as the current directory had been relying on troops to help them fix elections since at least 1797. The conspirators therefore looked around for a military man to provide the necessary muscle. Napoleon was by no means the first choice, but Republican generals such as Moreau or Bernadotte were hesitant to commit themselves, while the brilliant young Joubert somewhat ruined his chances of leading the coup by getting himself killed in battle. Napoleon therefore was. Despite making a bit of a hash of the coup itself in November of 1799, he again emerged victorious. Somewhat to the consternation of some of his fellow conspirators, he appointed himself as first consul of the Republic and effective leader of France. He was at this stage just 30 years old. So how then did this relative youngster, now at the helm of a country of 30 million people, proceed? We've already seen that the revolution up to this stage had created a legacy of shifting values, ideologies, and regimes. Some, in fact, hoped that Napoleon would prove to be a French general monk, who had taken power in England in 1660 and promptly restored the Stuart monarchy. Napoleon quickly disabused French royalists of any such notion, telling the exile royalists that they should give up any hope of ever returning to the throne of France. Instead, he hurriedly created a new regime, the consulate, with himself at its head. France remained a republic, but for the first time since 1792, it now had a single preeminent leader in both law and fact. This basic point is often at the heart of accusations that Napoleon betrayed the revolution. Instead of effectively ruling by committee of equals, as had the emergency government of the National Convention and the later Directory, Napoleon gave himself as first consul significantly more power than anyone else. Many Republican historians of the 19th century, and perhaps to their Marxist successors of the 20th, Napoleon was a military dictator who wrenched France from the path of revolution for his own personal power. Yet this interpretation is perhaps mistaken on two fronts. Firstly, Napoleon was by no means a military dictator, and secondly, he actually continued with many of the traits of the revolution. To deal first with the issue of military dictatorship, there is admittedly quite a strong circumstantial case for this. Napoleon was a military man, seized power in a military coup, and in the first year of his regime, he subjugated around a third of France to military justice and policing by using the army to wipe out banditry and bring it back under control. He was also not averse to appointing military officers to key posts in civilian administration, especially in the prefectural corps. Yet throughout the consulate and empire, he preferred to rely on civilian administration where possible, believing it more effective than military governance. He also did not fundamentally rely on the army to keep him in power. Instead, he built a power base from the so-called masses of granite, institutions of the civil state, and the civilian men who ran them. And this brings us to our second point, which is that Napoleon's reign did maintain a degree of popular support, and it did fundamentally continue many of the traits of the revolution. We can, in fact, go further. Almost everything that Napoleon did was in some way rooted in revolutionary precedent. He certainly did not keep everything from the revolution, but nor would it have been possible to do so. The revolution was too fractured, too self-contradictory, too unfinished for any person or regime to have encompassed all of its values and ideals. Yet in his approach to administration, to institutions, and to legal systems, he built on revolutionary foundations. The idea that Napoleon was somehow a great liberal or a man of the people is, of course, a load of nonsense, much of which was begun by Napoleon himself in his attempts on St. Helena to craft a legend of his own greatness. But the fact that he failed to live up to the most optimistic aspirations of the revolution does not mean that he did not continue its practices. What then did Napoleon do, and how was it revolutionary in nature? Take first his system of government, with one man at the top. This perhaps went against the spirit of the convention and the directory, but they themselves can justifiably be accused of abandoning the spirit of 1789. Napoleon's constitutions were in fact akin to what had been imagined or even hoped for when the Estates General met at Versailles in 1789. A strong central authority emerging from the will of the people, limited by a constitution, overseen by bodies of the people's elected representatives. Napoleon took great care to legitimize his regime with popular referenda, or plebiscites as they were called at the time, and until the very end, he maintained that the legitimacy of his rule rested on it being the will of the French people. For sure, these plebiscites were rigged in his favor, and by the end of the consulate, Napoleon had tamed the elected bodies and bent them to his will. But the principle of government was by no means against the spirit of the early revolution. The elections of Napoleonic France, as limited as they were, can also be said to hold to revolutionary principles. Almost all men could vote, which was in keeping with some of the more radical sentiments of revolutionary representation. But in the creation of indirect suffrage, this also perhaps revived the active-passive distinction of 1791. Even the principle of hereditary government was something accepted by the early revolutionaries in 1789 to 92. Those who accuse Napoleon of betraying the revolution, for taking the country from republic to empire, show a rather blinkered view of what the revolution actually was, and also perhaps ignore the fact that by 1799, all other attempts to create a stable republic had ended in corruption and neo-dictatorship. There was not really a whole lot to betray on that score. In administration, Napoleon also continued rather than betrayed the revolution. He kept the departments created in 1790, but strengthened them with the creation of the prefects, individuals appointed by Paris to oversee local administration. This initiative was a departure from revolutionary practice. But was it all that different, really, from the centralizing of the Jacobin Republic of the terror years of 1793 to 4, which very consciously rejected the idea of divided sovereignty and local difference in proclaiming and violently enforcing a republic one and indivisible? I would argue not. Napoleon also continued and indeed enhanced the revolution's work in reforming systems of education, justice and finance, founding the lycées, new courts and the Bank of France, all of which placed France on a much firmer footing than it enjoyed during the 1790s. Just like the revolutionaries, Napoleon optimistically believed that these new systems could be imposed on the nation and made to work. The only real difference, as Michael Brewers has pointed out, was that Napoleon had the drive, commitment, and sheer force of personality to make these aspirations a reality. If some of the reforms departed from the flighty and idealistic fantasies of the early revolutionaries, it did embrace the general revolutionary desire of creating practical and pragmatic solutions to France's problems. Napoleon's approach to the law can also be shown to have continued the projects of the revolution rather than betraying them. While the enthusiasm of the early revolutionaries swept aside the old provincial distinctions and created to create a France of legal equality, it was Napoleon who collected and codified this legislation in his civil code, later modestly renamed the Code Napoleon and the Criminal Code. Moreover, his regime showed a great general commitment to upholding the rule of law and to treating everybody equally before it. Certainly, there are examples where the regime strayed from this, both in individual cases involving high-ranking personalities and in general cases such as the enforcement of conscription, but in this it was no different to any previous revolutionary regimes. The law may have at times favoured the rich, but everyone was equal before it, and everyone was subject to the same courts, the same penalties, and the same punishments. In this regard, at least, Napoleon showed an absolute adherence to the principle of revolutionary equality. We certainly shouldn't exaggerate Napoleon's commitment to equality. He, after all, did reintroduce nobility into France. He gave the wealthiest notables of the empire special, if not legally privileged, places in society. And yet, even in this, we can see that his ideas are grounded in those of the revolution. The nobility that Napoleon created was awarded not on account of birth, but on account of service to the state. The direct implementation, then, of the demands of the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen that social distinctions should only be founded on public utility. In two areas, however, Napoleon is generally accepted to have departed from the spirit of the revolution, in undoing some of the very mild advances in women's rights that had come with the revolution and in the reintroduction of slavery. On the latter point, I offer absolutely no defense, as this was clearly contrary to the spirit of common humanity and the rights of man espoused by enlightened thinkers and embraced by many revolutionaries. But on the former point, I will introduce a few caveats. Napoleon had no intention of creating a society with gender equality, but then nor had the revolution. Like the revolution, his regime did actually offer a very few minor gains, such as the introduction of equality of inheritance. Also, like the revolution, it did so while openly proclaiming the subordinate place of women in society. Napoleon's civil code certainly reinforced patriarchal tendencies in French society, but in this, it generally carried on the indifference of the revolution to the inequalities facing women. Napoleon can therefore be seen to have had a strong general commitment to equality before the law, at least, even if those laws were sometimes deeply uneven. His commitment to liberty, however, was perhaps a bit more tenuous. Napoleon's state was, in some respects, based on control of information through censorship, control of people through the introduction of passports and workers' booklets that prevented people from travelling within France or moving jobs without their employer's consent. This is certainly a far cry from the revolutionary ideal of liberty, yet the revolution itself demonstrated rather rapidly that liberty was more an ideal than a practice. The brutality shown in crushing the mutiny in Nancy in 1790, the use of force to curtail the freedom of expression of the Champ de Mars in 1791, the apparatus of the Terror 1793 to 94, and the continued purges of those considered politically undesirable throughout the Directory show that Napoleon's apparently authoritarian regime was not exactly betraying any great tradition of liberalism. This is perhaps a matter of degree, with Napoleon more fully abandoning liberty in favour of stability, although by 1799 many in France welcomed an end to the anarchy that had grown up in the provinces during the revolutionary decade. Overall, however, to accuse Napoleon of bringing an end to a golden age of French revolutionary liberty would be to badly misrepresent what the revolution actually did, rather than what its apologists wish it had done. Moreover, Napoleon did maintain a respect for the fundamental individual freedom espoused by the early revolution, supporting the abolition of serfdom and feudal regimes when he came across them. Napoleon's relationship with religion and the church is also sometimes criticized, especially amongst the more secular Republican critics. But even here, it can be seen that Napoleon's approach was once more in keeping with some aspects of the revolution. The Ancien regime privileges of the Catholic Church were significantly curtailed after 1789, and theoretical freedom of Christian worship was enacted across France. The radical phase of the revolution then saw a strong move towards secularity, with churches closed, priests arrested, and public worship effectively banned. Napoleon, however, resurrected France's relationship with the Pope, creating the so-called Concordat in 1801 that recognized Catholicism as the religion of the majority of Frenchmen, and agreeing to, that the French state would provide for the Catholic clergy in exchange for loyalty and rights over appointment. This was certainly an abandonment of the radical irreligion, but it was actually a step back towards the constitutional church of 1790 to 91. Although it did give the Catholic Church a privileged position in society, it effectively made religion subordinate to the state, a key goal of the early revolutionaries. Napoleon also insisted on freedom of worship for non-Catholics, continuing and staunchly defending the revolutionary principle that all should have freedom of conscience. Napoleon also tended to export this approach into conquered, annexed, and even allied territories, and it's on his foreign policies and practices but I would like to make one final point. Although Napoleon, like much else, I suppose, with his foreign successes, did these on somewhat of a grander scale than those of the revolution, they were largely in keeping with the practices that had developed during the previous decade. Without intending to deny the culpability of any of the parties involved, the Napoleonic Wars were a direct legacy of the French Revolutionary Wars of the 1790s. The conquest of neighbouring lands, the imposition of heavy indemnities, and the reorganisation of governments began with the revolutionary armies in Belgium, in the Netherlands, the Rhineland, and then Switzerland, and of course with Napoleon himself in Italy as a general in the 1790s. The expansion of France through war and annexation was therefore a revolutionary trend, simply taken to a new extreme by Napoleon. Moreover, France's enemies often made little distinction between the revolutionary armies and the later legions of the so-called emperor. To many of the people he conquered, Napoleon was the revolution, not the liberalizing and fraternal impulses of the early years, chimeral as they were, but the incarnation of the revolution militant of the later 1790s. He had been one of the prime movers of expansionism after 1796, and the fact that he now wore an emperor's crown rather than a general's hat fooled no one. For on the coattails of his imperial armies came reform, constitutions, legal codes, secularism, or enforced religious toleration, attacks on privilege, attacks on servitude, and frequently dismembering of states, an invention of successors. The reforms were not always welcomed, and they can be seen as simply a tool of French imperialism, but many people in Europe nevertheless only came face to face with the French Revolution when it arrived in the baggage of the armies of Napoleon. Even his eventual meddling with central authority in allied or satellite states, such as the imposition of his brothers as monarchs in Naples, Holland, Westphalia, and Spain, can be understood as a natural progression of the revolution's tendencies to control neighbouring countries with French military and administrative personnel, especially during the late 1790s. This then is Napoleon's relationship with the French Revolution. Far from him being its betrayer, I would argue that his own practices largely built on those of the revolutionary decade, for better or for worse. Napoleon was undoubtedly a son of the revolutionary events of the 1790s, catapulted to fame and eventually power by the opportunities afforded by the tumultuous reorganization of France and the chaos of war. But he was also a continuer of the revolution. Almost all of his acts can be seen as continuing the trends of the revolutionary years, from building on its institutions to creating a new state by popular consent, to building on its foreign relations. Where he apparently regressed, such as in the abandonment of the Republic, curtailing liberties, or favouring men of wealth, it is still possible to point to examples in the decades 1789 to 99 where these practices were embraced by a majority of revolutionaries. There is, of course, an element of cherry picking here. If every action of Napoleon's can be shown to have followed an example from the revolution, there are also many points of the revolution that depart from Napoleon's principles and practices. Yet the fact remains that Napoleon's actions almost always built on foundations dug, sometimes inadvertently, by the revolution. So to answer the question we set ourselves to start with, did Napoleon betray the revolution? I would argue no, largely for the reasons I've stated, but I would acknowledge that it would be possible to answer with an equally emphatic yes. But this is only because of the essential contradictions of the revolution. It began in the name of liberty and equality, and during its course embraced deeply illiberal and inegalitarian practices. The revolution sought to reform the state, but it was better at breaking down the old regime than building a new. It wished for men to be free, but it sought to impose that freedom at the point of a gun. Napoleon, perhaps most of all, resembled the revolution in himself being a man of great contradictions. He believed that men had rights, but he could not stomach being limited by any declaration of the rights of man. He believed that all should be equal before the law, and then he proceeded to make laws that were restrictive and unequal, and that favoured wealthy men. He believed in legal codes and constitutions, but only insofar as they did not impinge on his ability to rule as he pleased. And he believed in exporting the values of equality and even liberty, even while refusing anyone the freedom to act as his equal. These values were to be imposed from above, not claimed from below. Napoleon indeed could be seen as the revolution incarnate. He reflected its hopes, dreams, contradictions, projects, achievements, and even perhaps its ultimate failure. Like the revolution, Napoleon has divided opinion. There are some who laud the achievements while glossing over the many faults. There are others who deplore the excesses while ignoring the successes. In sum, then, I don't believe that Napoleon betrayed the revolution. Whether you stand politically to the left or to the right or even in the centre, the revolution really betrayed itself long before Napoleon hove into view. Napoleon was simply the revolution's culmination. The man who died 200 years ago today on that small island in the South Atlantic was, for the 15 years of its reign, the living continuation of the French Revolution. A man who shared its greatness, but who also shared its many flaws. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Graeme. I'm sure if this were obviously in person, there would be some great applause now. So let's see if it's going to come back. So you've stopped sharing. So thank you very much, Graeme, for what was, as I would imagine it would always be, a fantastic talk that built on a number of different interpretations and readings, both of the revolution as well as Napoleon himself. So when I said at the beginning, I thought I knew both of those things and I didn't, that's because of Graeme's skill in unpicking that for all of us. There've been some really interesting questions that have come through. So if that's okay with you, Graeme, we've got about 15 minutes to work through some of these questions. So the first one, this is from me myself, just to try and get a sense and a handle on what you're talking about. You mentioned, of course, the ways in which Napoleon is engaging with aspects of the revolution and its ideals, but also, of course, the functions, the actual performance of those where possible. In what ways do you think Napoleon kind of deviated from those ideals? In what ways then is he different to the revolution and those ideas?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because Napoleon, of course, while he can be seen to have continued ideas of the revolution, can always pick other bits that he differed enormously. So in terms of popular representation, Napoleon's practice of this was to have indirect voting, so everyone could vote, or most men could vote, but they voted for someone else, who voted for someone else, who voted for a candidate chosen by Napoleon. So you could vote, but you couldn't vote for anyone that Napoleon didn't want you to vote for. And in that, I would argue that that's a departure from the principle of the revolution. Whether it's a departure from its practice is another question. because of course they rigged the votes during the revolution anyway. But it's certainly a departure from its principles. In terms of personal liberty, though, I think that will be the main one. Napoleon introduced in France a system of control over individuals that was far greater than anything that the Ancien regime had ever had. So far greater than the king had ever been able to enforce. He largely did this, one, for public order reasons, two, for conscription. He didn't want the men of France moving around, traveling, running away from his conscription officers, essentially. But to control people, he introduces internal passports. So you can't leave your own small area without a passport. You can't leave your department. He also introduces these booklets for workers that your employer controls. So you can't leave employment and take employment with anyone else without your employer agreeing to it. And in controlling the freedom of movement and work of individuals, I would say that is the major departure from the revolutionary principle of freedom. I suppose I can explain why he did it, but I don't think anyone can defend it as being principled with freedom.
Excellent. Thank you, Graeme. So that certainly makes sense to me. A few more questions now are coming in. So if we go, can you see these as well, Graeme? This came through during the talk, and I think it's from Neil. Is there something to be said about Napoleon's establishment of a very repressive internal security apparatus, or can any excesses be safely attributed to Fouché?
Yeah, a really good question, actually. Well, Fouché, for those who aren't familiar with the chap, is basically Napoleon's head of secret police. He's a bit of an enforcer, I suppose, in some ways. And until 1810, he's very much in Napoleon's good books because he keeps this security apparatus going. Fouché is a very useful character, but I don't think that Napoleon was unaware of what was going on. The two worked hand in hand. Napoleon used Fouché to do the dirty work for him, essentially. In terms of repressive internal security apparatus, censorship was being used. People were arrested for opinions, but Napoleon was no dictator having people executed. No, he's no Stalin here. He doesn't have people bumped off. He doesn't have many people, at least, executed for their opinions, normally for what they did rather than for what they thought. He does exile a lot of people, sometimes to French Guiana, the so-called dry guillotine, because of malaria, etc. But basically, Napoleon, I'd say, very much knows what's going on with this. Fouché is simply the man that does it, and does it very well, putting in place a secret police and making sure that they are very effective in rounding up enemies of the empire, apart from Mallet, who was able to nearly overthrow Napoleon in 1812.
Excellent. Thank you, Graeme. And then, again, a few more questions are coming through. One is looking at the question, I guess, of totalitarian belief and practice. So it's kind of building partly on the question you've just answered, Graeme. But it's more of a kind of general observation. Which one would you consider to be more totalitarian? Is it the Napoleonic regime or the French monarchy themselves?
A difficult question, because the French monarchy was just too inefficient to be totalitarian. So the French monarchy, under the old regime, the king had absolute power, theoretically, but in practice, he could only wield that power if the people beneath him agreed. Basically, if his nobles and the big men of the state agreed with him. So everything that he did was a matter of negotiation. If he tried to do something deeply unpopular, the provinces could refuse. And there were enough checks there to stop the French monarchy from being totalitarian. I would actually say, had the French monarchy been more absolute and more totalitarian, there wouldn't have been a revolution, because they would have simply solved France's problems themselves. They wouldn't have needed an Estates General. So I suppose the answer has to be Napoleon, the Napoleonic regime, but only because the monarchy was so rubbish at being totalitarian. It was absolute in the way that people didn't have an input into it, but not totalitarian in the way that it could actually exert control over people. If that answers the question.
Yeah, excellent. And again, I think a number of these questions are touching on this idea of repression and control, perhaps again as a way of thinking about the ways in which Napoleon undermines aspects of the revolutionary aims. So a further question, this one from Christy: how did his limits on individual freedom, so kind of what you've been talking about so far, Graeme, compare with the English Act of Settlement repealed in 1795?
I mean, Napoleon's limits on freedoms were greater than the ones in Britain, because I mean they were very controlling of how individuals could move, where they could move, what they could do, and England didn't quite have the same limitations. On the other hand, Napoleon gave great freedoms elsewhere. So Napoleon believed in freedom of religion. England at the time didn't. In England, if you were not Church of England, technically you shouldn't be in power. Catholics had no legal rights in England till 1829. England in the 1790s is a very repressive place in many ways if you're not part of the establishment. Napoleon, therefore, was repressive in different ways, I suppose. If you lived in England at the time, you would have had more individual freedoms than in Napoleonic France. Censorship was a lot lower in Britain as well. Britain didn't have pre-publication censorship. They simply prosecuted people afterwards who annoyed the government and called them or accused them of sedition, for example. But in Napoleonic France, there was pre-publication censorship that by the end meant that almost nothing of any interest got published at all. So very, very different types of limitations on individual freedoms. But you're absolutely right that Napoleon's regime is not unusual to the time. And England, despite the fact that it held itself up as a great place of liberty, really wasn't unless you happen to be exceptionally rich.
Excellent. Thank you, Graeme. And again, they're all coming in now, all these questions. And this one by Freddie. And it's a question actually I was thinking of myself as well, Freddie. So when Napoleon declares himself as emperor, was this not seen as synonymous with the monarchy that the revolution had sought to remove? Was this a popular move, or was his power simply too great to challenge it? So again, I guess that's talking about how Napoleon is moving away from these revolutionary aims, and certainly the transition into empire, which as an ancient historian is what I'm probably most interested in, Graeme. So thank you, Freddie, for posing that.
So when Napoleon declares himself emperor, he takes on the trappings of monarchy. There's a crown, there's capes, there's the rest of it. But actually, he chooses the word or the title emperor because it didn't mean monarch. It does now. We have them as synonymous. An emperor just seems to be a bit better than the monarch. But then an emperor kind of had more of the Latin connotation of imperator, which is simply a leader, a commander. It's not the word for an emperor as such, as we would know it. And so he deliberately chooses that to move away from this idea of being a king. He also calls himself for a year or so emperor of the French Republic, which might seem weird to us, but he doesn't see this as a contradiction. He sees that he can continue with the revolutionary calendar. He can continue calling France a republic, even while he's emperor, because he's there by the will of the people. And he justifies this through a popular plebiscite. So he has a vote. All men who are allowed to vote can have a say in this, and he wins it overwhelmingly. It's a couple of million in favor, a couple of thousand against. The fact that it was an open vote, you had to actually walk and sign your name on a register in front of officials of the state, probably helped keep the numbers of opponents down. But nonetheless, he had this big facade of popular acceptance. But let's also not forget, in 1804, he was genuinely enormously popular, because this is the first ruler since 1789 to give any stability to France. He'd stopped the banditry, he'd stopped the unrest, he'd stopped the war. He'd won the war, essentially. Okay, it had restarted with Britain, but there was no actual fighting. It was kind of a phony war. So yes, he was very popular at that point. People later did see it synonymous with a move back to monarchy, but that only upset the Republicans. And by this stage, there wasn't many of them. Most kind of moderates in the centre were happy with a monarchy as long as it pretended to be run by the will of the people.
Excellent, thank you, Graeme. And of course, I'm always happy to hear you discuss Latin and the ideas of imperium. And although it's not my talk at all, it's all about Graeme, it is worth recognising, of course, imperator in the Roman world, which certainly some contemporaries were aware of, was not a king. It's deliberately not a king, and it was designed to be something very different. So you're absolutely right there, Graeme. Again, more questions are coming through, so if you're still okay to answer them. Now the questions are turning more to the Republic and the ideas of the revolution. So one attendee asks, did the Republic stray more from the initial revolutionary values than necessarily under Napoleon himself?
Yes, possibly. I think Napoleon does revert back to the values of the early revolution a lot more than the Republic had done. The Republic 1793 to 4 certainly is a complete departure from the initial values. The revolution of 1789 envisaged changing France quite significantly socially, perhaps, but it envisaged having a king, a constitution, some voting. It envisaged largely voting by wealthy men and nothing more. It envisaged a country run efficiently, but by no means a country of absolute equality or where the average man on the street would have a huge say. The Republic of 1793 to 4 got rid of the king, or they executed him in January of 1793. They were far, far more radical, and the period of the terror is it strays from revolutionary values of 1789 enormously. The Directory a bit less so. The Directory goes back to being kind of bourgeois, a more middle class republic, I suppose we could say, but it is still a republic. The Directory also, although it wants to be efficient, it can't be for various reasons that are probably too complex to go into. But basically, the Directory never manages to run France on the efficient lines that the early revolution had envisaged. And the Directory is also propped up by the army. It is propped up by continuing the war externally and by the army purging the assemblies and fixing votes internally. And that is a long way from those revolutionary values as well. So I think it's a really good question and a very good point as well. The revolution or the Republic is straying from those initial values before Napoleon.
Excellent. Thank you, Graeme. And we're almost out of time. So I think we've answered all the questions. Otherwise, obviously, I could continue talking to you, Graeme, about Napoleon, and in particular comparing him to Caesar. That's certainly what jumped out to me all the way through in the transition to Republic and Empire. But I just want to finish today's session by thanking you for taking the time out to talk to us about Napoleon and the revolution, but also I think identifying the inherent complexities, not simply in Napoleon as a character, a political creature, but also someone who's creating his own legacy. That's something I've not really considered, and how that then shapes his interpretation of the revolution, but also his understanding and practice of that. And I think, certainly, I'm no specialist here, Graeme, as you know, I was completely won over by your argument, and I hope obviously that each of those attendees were also won over in the same way. So with those words, then I'd like to thank Graeme for taking the time, for giving us this excellent talk, really informative and enjoyable. And I'm sure Graeme will echo this. We wish you all the very best, and thank you for joining us. Any last words, Graeme?
Yeah, just one last thing. If anyone does have any other questions, if something occurs to you and you just want to chat about it, I'm on Twitter. It's just at Graeme Callister if you want to tweet me. So I'm happy to answer questions by that as well. If anyone wants to carry on the chat over on a different platform. But thanks so much for everyone's attendance.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Graeme. That was brilliant.
Thanks.
Bye-bye, everyone.